Welcome to Incentives Matter, your guide to what's new in behavioral science and behavioral economics. Let's see what's really driving decisions. So imagine this. Economists, nearly every single one of them, agree that carbon taxes and cap-and-trade systems are the absolute cheapest, most efficient ways to fight climate change. They are the gold standard.
The discussion revolves around Pigovian taxes, which involve putting a price on pollution and letting markets do their thing.
Exactly. Yet when these policies are put before voters or legislatures, they are routinely rejected. Instead, what do we get? Rigid, often much more expensive, command and control environmental standards.
And the kicker? A new NBER working paper reveals that voters aren't rejecting market-based tools because they're anti-environment. They're rejecting them because they fundamentally misunderstand how costs are passed through the economy.
They actually believe that those rigid, expensive standards will have less impact on their electricity bills than a carbon tax, which, as any economist will tell you, is the precise opposite of reality.
It's an inversion of economic logic, driven by a profound behavioral blind spot.
That disconnect is truly staggering. For decades, there has been a frustrating loop where environmental economists wave their hands, pointing to the optimal solutions, and then the public and politicians choose something else entirely. The NBER working paper, Understanding Support for Inefficient Environmental Policy Instruments, published just this past April, really drills down into why this happens.
The authors, Chenxi Zhang, Maximiliano Lauletta, Roe Levy, Joseph S. Shapiro, and Dmitry Tobinsky from UC Berkeley and other institutions took a really elegant approach. They designed a nationally representative survey experiment. The key was holding the environmental impact, the amount of emissions reduction, strictly constant across different policy scenarios.
So whether they were looking at a consumer tax, a producer tax, a cap-and-trade system, or those command and control standards, the outcome for the planet was presented as identical. The only thing changing was the mechanism.
Precisely, and the findings were stark. Even with identical environmental benefits, respondents overwhelmingly preferred those rigid standards. And if they had to choose a market-based tool, they still leaned towards producer taxes or cap-and-trade over direct consumer taxes.
It's like asking someone if they'd rather take a $5 bill directly from their wallet or have a $5 charge added to some nebulous future bill, and they consistently pick the latter, even if it ends up costing them more. But the most damning finding, the one that really highlights this chasm between expert knowledge and public perception, came from a parallel survey.
Yes, they surveyed a panel of professional environmental economists, and the results, when compared to the general public, create a truly depressing comedy of errors. The economists, as expected, correctly identified that environmental standards are highly inefficient and therefore increase consumer energy bills more than market-based instruments. And the voters? The typical survey respondents believed the exact opposite. They confidently stated that environmental standards increase their energy bills less than market-based instruments. It's not just a slight disagreement, it's a complete flip.
That's the crux of it, isn't it? Voters aren't rejecting carbon taxes because they're suddenly against a cleaner environment. They're rejecting them because their mental model of how costs ripple through the economy is fundamentally flawed. They perceive one type of policy as a direct hit to their wallet and the other as a corporate problem that won't touch them.
That flawed mental model is where the behavioral economics comes in. The paper calls it the pass-through illusion. It's a failure to understand basic tax incidence and cost pass-through.
Explain tax incidence for listeners who might not have an economics degree. In simple terms, tax incidence is about who actually bears the burden of a tax, regardless of who is legally responsible for paying it to the government. The liability side equivalence principle in economics states that it doesn't matter if you tax the producer or the consumer. The economic burden depends on how supply and demand respond. Think of it like this. If you tax a utility company, that company isn't just going to absorb the cost out of thin air. They'll pass it down the supply chain, ultimately to consumers, in the form of higher electricity rates.
So if a politician says they're going to make corporations pay for environmental cleanup, the average voter hears, "I won't have to pay anything." But the reality is that the corporation will simply bake that cost into their prices.
Exactly. And Zhang et al. Show that the average voter does not track this. When a policy is framed as a standard or a producer tax, the cost becomes effectively invisible to the end consumer. The voter assumes the mandate comes out of corporate profits. They suffer from this illusion that corporate mandates are free to the public.
It's the ultimate stealth tax, but it's not even a tax, it's just a hidden cost. And the study found that the public vastly prefers taxing producers over taxing consumers. That sounds like it ties directly into a well-established behavioral economics concept.
It does. It's a classic case of tax salience. This concept was really brought to prominence by Raj Chetty, Adam Looney, and Corey Croft in their 2009 work on salience and taxation. They showed that people don't fully optimize their behavior around taxes if those taxes aren't highly visible.
Listeners might recall the grocery store experiment.
Yes, the famous one, where they showed that posting tax-inclusive prices on shelves reduced demand by 8%. If taxes were only visible at the register, people often ignored them in their purchasing decisions. It's a powerful demonstration of how the visibility of a cost changes behavior.
So, in the climate policy context, a direct consumer carbon tax is highly salient. It's a line item on your utility bill, a clear dollar amount that you can point to. That triggers immediate loss aversion. People hate losing what they perceive as their money, even if the alternative is a hidden larger loss.
Precisely, that direct hit is emotionally salient. A producer tax or a regulatory standard, on the other hand, hides that cost within the final price of the electricity. The brain simply fails to process that hidden cost, leading to this penalty for the transparent policy and, perversely, a reward for the more opaque one.
The term hypersalience has been used for this.
Yes, some legal and behavioral scholars use hypersalience to describe when the prominence of a tax provision leads taxpayers to vastly overestimate its economic burden compared to less visible alternatives. So, a typical voter looks at a consumer carbon tax and experiences hypersalience, feeling a disproportionate thing, while looking at a complex regulatory mandate and experiencing zero price pain, even if the latter ultimately costs them more.
The term hypersalience has been used for this.
Yes, some legal and behavioral scholars use hypersalience to describe when the prominence of a tax provision leads taxpayers to vastly overestimate its economic burden compared to less visible alternatives. So, a typical voter looks at a consumer carbon tax and experiences hypersalience, feeling a disproportionate sting, while looking at a complex regulatory mandate and experiencing zero price pain, even if the latter ultimately costs them more.
So this isn't just about preferring one type of policy over another, it's about how that preference then impacts the ambition of the environmental targets. This is where the paper gets even messier and, frankly, quite fascinating.
It does. The researchers uncovered a severe paradox in how voters calibrate their environmental demands based on the policy instrument, and it's a direct consequence of this pass-through illusion.
Walk us through it.
The NBER paper found that respondents preferred the weakest environmental targets when the policy was framed as a consumer tax. Because they felt the acute psychological pain of that salient tax, they wanted the policy to be as mild as possible. They basically expressed a sentiment along the lines of, if one has to pay, let's not do too much. But then, when those exact same environmental goals were framed as standards, then respondents suddenly demanded the strongest possible targets. Because their mental model told them standards were free to the consumer, they effectively maxed out their environmental ambitions. It's a stark stringency versus efficiency trade-off that the public seems unable to reconcile. This has huge implications for policymakers. If a lawmaker genuinely wants to pass aggressive, ambitious climate action, they're in a bind. If they propose a carbon tax, voters will only tolerate a weak, watered-down version of it because of that visible cost.
That's right. The political reality means the lawmaker is practically forced by voter psychology to use the most expensive, inefficient policy tool available, those command and control standards, just to achieve meaningful environmental targets. It's a political expediency born from a cognitive bias.
It's almost as if society is paying a massive cognitive bias premium on all environmental legislation. Because the public's bounded rationality prevents them from doing the math on cost pass-through, society as a whole ends up paying billions of dollars more to reduce emissions through inefficient standards rather than through efficient market mechanisms.
A very expensive illusion. It begs the question, is this just a failure of political messaging, or is it an unfixable quirk of human nature?
Well, the researchers actually tried to fix it, at least in the lab. They designed an intervention specifically to address this economic illiteracy.
They did. Having identified that a lack of economic understanding was driving these policy preferences, Zhang, Tobinsky, and their co-authors tested a solution. They randomly assigned participants to watch one of two short educational videos, or be part of a control group that watched neither.
The first video, the pass-through video, sounds like it directly tackled the core problem.
It did. It explained the concepts of economic incidence and cost pass-through in non-technical language. Crucially, it used gasoline as an example to show how a commodity tax on a business is passed through to consumer prices, making the final price the same whether the tax is collected from the consumer or the business. It aimed to make the invisible visible. And the second video, that was the alligative efficiency video. It explained the concept of cost effectiveness, again in non-technical language, directly comparing a tax on emissions with a rigid standard to show why the tax is cheaper for society. It was about understanding the benefits of efficiency. So, did these educational videos actually work? Did they shift preferences? Surprisingly, yes. The data showed that these videos actually worked. Educating voters on how energy bills are calculated significantly shifted their policy support. After watching the videos, the respondents' preferences moved closer to the expert consensus, closing a significant portion of the gap between the general public and environmental economists.
That's a huge finding. It suggests that the preference for inefficient standards isn't some immovable ideological stance, but a correctable deficit in economic literacy. The pass-through illusion can, at least in a controlled environment, can be dispelled.
In the lab, it absolutely can. But this is where a critical perspective is needed, and one must be wary of nudge washing.
The term behavioral scientists use for overhyping small interventions as magical cures.
Exactly. Nudge washing is when small behavioral interventions are presented as a panacea for deep systemic problems, often without rigorous real-world backing. The question becomes, does this rational mindset, induced by a 3-minute video, survive outside the sterile environment of a survey?
Because in the real world, a voter isn't just watching a neutral, non-technical video about gasoline taxes. They're bombarded by highly emotive, multi-million-dollar partisan attack ads. They're influenced by identity politics, motivated reasoning, social media echo chambers.
Precisely. If a think tank runs an educational campaign on cost pass-through, will it actually change votes at the ballot box? Or will it be drowned out by a politician screaming, "My opponent wants to tax your electricity and it will raise your bills"? The lab proves the mechanism of the bias and that it's correctable, but relying on mass economic education as a primary political strategy seems like a fool's errand.
So, what does this mean for the everyday listener? What's the takeaway when listeners are confronted with a new regulation or a politician making promises about who will pay?
It means individuals are all susceptible to the pass-through illusion. Every time a local ballot measure proposes a new regulation on businesses, or a politician promises to make corporations pay for environmental cleanup, voters naturally assume their own wallets are safe. Understanding human bounded rationality and cognitive blind spots is the first step to making better democratic choices.
And for policymakers, this paper offers a pretty clear lesson, doesn't it? Instead of complaining that voters are economically illiterate, climate advocates and policymakers need to become better choice architects.
Absolutely. The NBER paper strongly implies that transparency in pricing, while economically beautiful and favored by purists, is politically fatal. If behavioral economics indicates that people suffer from tax salience and loss aversion, policymakers should design policies that work with these biases rather than trying to lecture voters out of them.
So instead of fighting for transparent consumer carbon taxes, which voters will reject, they should embrace the hidden costs of producer taxes and cap-and-trade systems.
That's one implication. If voters prefer those because the costs are hidden, perhaps policymakers should stop fighting for the textbook-perfect transparent consumer carbon taxes and just use the tools the public will accept, even if they are slightly less efficient. It's a pragmatic approach to an imperfect system.
And if a visible tax is deemed necessary, then it needs to be paired with an equally visible, equally salient reward.
Exactly. This is why some economists advocate for carbon fee and dividend models, where the tax revenue is mailed directly back to citizens as a physical check. The hypersalience of the tax needs to be offset with the hypersalience of the reward. That direct, tangible benefit makes the overall policy more palatable.
So the Zhang et al. Paper is a masterpiece in diagnosing a political disease, showing that the public's demand for bad climate policy is rooted in this pass-through illusion.
It truly is. It clearly lays out the cognitive mechanism.
But the conclusion for practitioners and politicians seems to be, stop trying to teach economics to voters. Start designing climate policies that can actually survive the messy, biased reality of the human brain.
That seems to be the most practical lesson here. Acknowledge the bias and build policies around it.
So first, the pass-through illusion is a fundamental barrier to implementing efficient climate policy. Voters aren't rejecting good policy because they're anti-environment, but because they fundamentally misunderstand how costs are distributed through the economy.
Second, hidden costs are politically palatable, even if they're ultimately more expensive for society. Visible costs, on the other hand, trigger strong loss aversion and lead to rejection, regardless of their economic efficiency.
And third, while educational interventions can shift views in a controlled environment, the political reality of highly emotive messaging and partisan divides suggests that relying on mass economic education to change voter behavior is likely to be an uphill battle. Therefore, policymakers need to be pragmatic choice architects. They should design climate policies that work with human behavioral biases, embracing lower salience mechanisms like producer taxes or cap and trade, or pairing salient taxes with equally salient rewards like carbon dividends. This brings up some interesting questions. If voters only support climate action when the costs are hidden from them, is it ethical for democratic governments to intentionally use those low salience policies to essentially trick the public into paying for the energy transition?
And on the flip side, can a 3-minute video on economic incidents really permanently rewire a voter's brain? Or does that pass-through illusion return the moment they look at their utility bill and see a different, more politically charged message?
It also makes one wonder, why do economists consistently fail to anticipate the political backlash to perfectly efficient policies? Are economists suffering from their own cognitive bias by assuming humans will act as perfectly rational utility maximizers?
That's all for this episode of Incentives Matter. Join us next time as we keep unpacking what really drives decisions. Thanks for listening.
Choose wisely, or at least know why you didn't.